In fall of 2019, my neighbor gave me this. It's a vinyl record of speeches John Kennedy gave during his lifetime. My neighbor had held on to it because it was an interesting piece of history. Prior to the internet, if you wanted to hear speeches that JFK gave, this was your only way of doing that. But my neighbor no longer had a record player, and he figured that this record was better off with someone who was enough of a grandpa to still be listening to music on vinyl. I was very grateful for this gift when I initially received it, but I never anticipated what path it would eventually send me down. This video is going to be long. I would grab a beverage if I were you. Flash forward to March 2020. The nation is in lockdown, and I've listened to pretty much every single record I own. I came across the JFK speeches record again, and on a whim, I decided to give it another listen. His words had a profound impact on me. Not only was I struck by what a powerful and eloquent speaker he was, but I was shocked at how relevant so much of what he was saying still felt. Even though he was speaking from over 50 years in the past, so much of what he said felt like it could have been written yesterday. For anyone who knows me personally, this will come as no shock, but I am susceptible to bouts of obsession. And that night in my basement, listening to a long-dead president speak marked the beginning of an obsession. I decided I was going to write a song about JFK, but before I did that, I needed to learn everything. I spent weeks researching, reading, listening, watching, note-taking in a state of borderline mania. I learned a ton about JFK and his life and his politics and his leadership style, and the song that resulted from all of this research will be on streaming platforms this Friday. But there was one thing that I uncovered during my research that I found far more interesting than everything else, and there's only so much that you can squeeze into a 45-second verse. So I wanted to take some time and talk more at length about the Cuban Missile Crisis. I remember learning about the Cuban Missile Crisis in high school, but to describe the education I received on the crisis as anything more than skeletal would be a drastic overstatement. If memory serves, my education on the Cuban Missile Crisis went along the lines of this. In October 1962, the Soviet Union stationed nuclear missiles in Cuba, which made the U.S. mighty uncomfortable. So we spent the next 13 days negotiating with the USSR so that the missiles were removed. This is technically correct, but it glosses over a lot of details that I think are very important, so let's dive into them. First, let me set the scene. It's 1962 and the Cold War has been escalating for roughly 15 years. The USSR wants to spread communism across the world, and the United States wants to stop the spread of communism. This made things a little bit tense between the two nations, particularly when you take into account the nifty bombs that they had built that had the potential of turning an entire city into dust in a matter of seconds. The US had nuclear missiles stationed in Turkey, which gave them the notable upper hand. The Soviet missiles that were capable of reaching the United States were big, slow, and took a very long time to fuel. If the Soviets tried to launch a nuclear attack on the United States, the US could destroy their missile via Turkish forces before it even got off the ground. The leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, was not a man who enjoyed having the underhand. Then he saw this island off the coast of Florida that 3 years earlier had undergone a communist revolution. The island was now being run by this very angry man with very good facial hair. Khrushchev knew that if he could get offensive missiles into Cuba, then these Cuban missiles would have the same power over the US that the Turkish missiles had over the USSR. The only issue with this plan was that years earlier, Kennedy had told Khrushchev, hey, putting defense equipment in Cuba is fine, but if you put nuclear missiles into Cuba, the US will be forced to take action against you. And Khrushchev responded, psh, I would never put offensive missiles into Cuba. Who do you think we are? So Kennedy thought this was a promise he would never have to follow through on. But on October 16th, 1962, Kennedy was informed that Khrushchev had in fact gone back on that promise. Nuclear missiles were being assembled in Cuba, and they would be operational in a matter of days. Kennedy assembled a group of 14 men, whose job would be to find a solution to the mounting tensions that did not result in a nuclear apocalypse. This group of men was given the name the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM for short. Historians will be arguing about XCOM's actions for generations to come, but the one thing historians unanimously agree upon is that XCOM is a very cool name. When I was doing my research, I was really surprised to see how often opinions would flip inside of XCOM. Men would come into meetings dead set on a certain solution, then 2 hours would have their minds changed 180 degrees, and then another 2 hours later would have their minds changed 180 degrees back. Basically, no one had any idea what to do. It kind of seemed like XCOM's hands were tied. If the US launches an attack on Cuba, then the Soviet Union would be forced to retaliate with an attack on the US, and the world dissolves into nuclear war. If the US does nothing, it proves to Khrushchev that the US won't keep its promises and can be pushed around. This will probably result in an attack on the US, which the US will have to retaliate from, and the world dissolves into nuclear war. The contentious solution that XCOM arrived at was to install a naval blockade around Cuba. Any ships arriving to Cuba would be searched by US forces to ensure that no more missiles arrived. Khrushchev was furious. He wrote an apoplectic letter to Kennedy saying that this blockade was an obvious act of aggression, and the Soviet nuclear missile force was being put into full combat readiness. For the first time in history, the US moved its air command into DEFCON 2. DEFCON 1 being full-blown nuclear war. After almost 2 weeks of ferocious debates, late nights, and back-and-forth messages between Kennedy and Khrushchev, a compromise was drawn. The USSR would remove its nuclear missiles from Cuba if the US removed its missiles from Turkey. And the world moved back from the nuclear abyss it had been precariously inching towards. But this decision very nearly came too late. While tensions were escalating between the Soviets and the US, both of their navies had flooded the Atlantic Ocean with ships and submarines. The US had communicated to the USSR that if US ships needed to talk to Soviet subs, the US officers would drop depth charges as a signal to the men aboard the sub to come up and talk. These depth charges were really loud but ultimately harmless, so the USSR agreed that this was an appropriate way to signal from one vessel to another. However, in an almost world-ending bureaucratic blunder, no one communicated this to the men aboard the Soviet subs. So, imagine for a moment. You've been in a submarine for 2 straight days. You've been unable to communicate with your superiors to figure out what is going on above the water. When you last had communication with the surface, the whole world seemed on the edge of nuclear warfare. And then you start hearing explosions. The Soviet sub in question was armed with nuclear warheads, and the commanders on that sub motioned to launch the missile, understandably so. Under normal circumstances, if an attack is to be made, 2 officers must give the vote to launch, the captain and the political officer. They had both voted to move forward with the attack. But aboard this particular submarine, there happened to be a 3rd high-ranking naval officer. This gorgeous man, Vasily Arkhipov. His vote was required to launch the missile, and he said no. He, and he alone, voted to not launch the nuclear warhead, and instead surface so they could communicate with the USSR. That decision of one Soviet naval officer quite literally saved millions of lives. It is not an exaggeration in the slightest to say that we were moments away from the nuclear apocalypse. It blows my mind that people are still trying to have a holiday for this guy, and to my knowledge, we've never so much as had a parade for Vasily Arkhipov.
Fun fact, Columbus is in the bad place because of all the raping, slave trade, and genocide.
Someone put Vasily's face on a t-shirt. I will rep it until I die. It is mind-bending to know that the world came so close to the edge of this abyss, and I was finding out about it because my neighbor had some records he was trying to get rid of. I am really thankful that Vasily Arkhipov was aboard that submarine that day. And I'm even more thankful that John F. Kennedy was in the White House when all of this was happening. There were many, many, many politicians active in the 1960s who I don't think would have gotten us to the other side of this. This is not to say that JFK was a perfect man. He was absolutely flawed, and many of the actions he took in his personal life would be very, very problematic if repeated in today's culture. But infallibility is not a prerequisite for good leadership. Regardless of his personal affairs, this man navigated the United States through the most turbulent and hazardous situation we have faced in the last century. The only reason that any of us are alive today to write music, watch YouTube videos, play video games, fight on Facebook, fight on Twitter, binge Netflix, drink coffee, is because we were not blown into oblivion in 1962. Historians will analyze the nuances of Kennedy's decision-making for generations to come, but to say that JFK's actions came purely from intuition would be an outright lie. There are several things that Kennedy did before and during the crisis that allowed him to make these world-saving decisions. Chief among these things was Kennedy's strong and trusting relationship with other world leaders. The only reason that Kennedy was able to implement a blockade around Cuba in the first place was because he had spent the first 2 years of his presidency earning and strengthening the trust of the world leaders in NATO. Technically speaking, implementing a blockade around Cuba was an act of war. Kennedy called the blockade a quarantine as a way of sidestepping the warlike nature of the maneuver, but this renaming was a bit of political theater that every world leader could see through clear as day. They let Kennedy implement this blockade because they trusted that he was telling the truth when he said that Cuba was posing a serious threat to the United States. Kennedy was also willing to do things that made him deeply unpopular with his supporters and his critics alike. It's easy to look back at the Cuban Missile Crisis and assume that everyone was happy with the actions taken because they didn't result in the destruction of the world. However, Kennedy was deeply chastised for these decisions that he made. His plan for a blockade was called weak, cowardly even, and by not immediately launching an attack on Cuba and the USSR, many accused Kennedy of being soft on communism. However, Kennedy was no stranger to being told he was incorrect. In fact, one of the things that I think made him such a strong leader was that he sought out the opinions that did not align with his own. In Robert Kennedy's memoir on the crisis, 13 Days, he speaks on how the 14 men selected to be a part of XCOM were intentionally chosen so that there was a wide variety of opinions in the room. Kennedy did not want to be told he was right. He wanted to be told why he was wrong. Not so he could argue or prove or assert himself, but so he could understand every situation from every possible angle. When you are the most powerful man in the free world, people are going to disagree with your decisions. And Kennedy didn't resent this fact, he embraced it. Understanding the logic of someone who disagrees with you will only allow you to understand the nuances of a situation more deeply. I think a trap that many people, including myself, fall into is that when someone tells us we are wrong, our emotions take over and we get defensive and even aggressive. Kennedy never fell victim to this trap, even in a time when it would have been very, very easy to let your emotions run the room. I can only imagine how stressful this situation must have been. Imagine making decisions where one misstep, one misspelt word, one unforeseen repercussion, one misinterpreted word would mean death, not just for you, not just for your family and your loved ones, but for the entire nation and possibly the entire world. I have seen grown adults buckle under stressful commutes and Instagram fights. Can you even imagine the integrity and fortitude that was required to navigate this situation? Perhaps it was the monumental gravity of the situation that forced Kennedy to display what is likely his most important leadership trait. JFK thought through every single possible repercussion of every action he took during the crisis. Then he considered what his response to those repercussions would be, and how those responses would trigger further repercussions. Like a true chess master, he was thinking 5 moves ahead at all times, and keeping completely calm while doing it. All of this brings me to the elephant in the room. In 3 weeks' time, the United States must choose a leader. I'm a songwriter, I'm a composer, I'm an arranger. I am not a political scientist. I am not a political advisor. I am not a who should I vote for in the 2020 elections BuzzFeed quiz. However, when I vote this year, I will be taking into consideration everything that I learned while I was studying JFK and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I will be casting my vote for the candidate who I believe will earn the trust of foreign leaders, will be willing to make decisions that make him deeply unpopular even among his supporters, will actively seek out a diversity in opinions and never expect people to just blindly agree with him, who will think through every possible repercussion of every action he takes and will do all of this while maintaining a calm demeanor. I encourage everyone watching this to take these same considerations into account when they fill out this year's and every year's ballot. Because when the next Cuban Missile Crisis happens, it will not be history. It will not be something that happened to our grandparents. It will be right now, and it will be happening to us. This Friday, October 16th, 2020, marks the 58th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. My song, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, will be available on streaming services at that time. Thank you for watching, and thank you for listening.
If we fail to move ahead, if we fail to develop sufficient military and economic and social strength here in this country, then I think that the tide could begin to run against us. And I don't want historians 10 years from now to say, these were the years when the tide ran out for the United States. I want them to say, these were the years when the tide came in. These were the years when the United States started to move again. That's the question before the American people, and only you can decide what you want this country to be, what you want to do with the future. I think we're ready to move.